All right, guys, so Mr. Sherwin here. This is part two of our Unit 3 study guide, Jefferson through Tyler. So, the last things we were talking about Thomas Jefferson. Now we're going to jump into the Florida Purchase, the Adams-Onis Treaty. So, remember that for a long time, Florida, had sort of been a harbor for runaway slaves, problems with Native Americans and English settlers. And American settlers go in there, and Andrew Jackson, prior to the War of 1812, actually had gone in there before and sort of rattled his saber and beat some folks up because some whites were murdered by Native Americans, and so he becomes sort of a hero because of the Seminole War. So John Quincy Adams, another one of his foreign policy successes, purchases Florida in what's known as the Adams-Onis Treaty or the Florida Purchase Treaty. And this helps clear up boundaries of the western side of the Louisiana Purchase. And there are no more tenuous claims to Texas. Texas was in dispute as being part of the Louisiana Purchase. And so this effectively seals that deal. And the United States no longer assumes that parts of Texas were part of the of original Louisiana Purchase. Okay. So both the Adams-Onis Treaty and the Monroe Doctrine were under the tutelage of Secretary of State at the time, John Quincy Adams. Remember that John Quincy Adams is a very effective Secretary of State, not so much as a president. Okay. One of the other things, foreign policy that we get is dealing with Alaska, the Russo-American Treaty. I had a really good graph to show you, but essentially we'll talk about, there's a dispute between, the United Kingdom and America over where Oregon really lies, and we'll talk more about the Oregon problem later. But the United States believes it's a lot more north than it is. What the Russo-American Treaty is, it establishes a border of between the Oregon Country, which is still in dispute, and what is Alaska. So we do have a clear boundary to where Alaska starts on sort of the northwestern coast of the North America and the Oregon Country. We still haven't solved the Oregon border yet. We'll get to that a little bit later. Okay. Election of 1824. Remember, we got Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, and Jackson. We have a tie. To break the tie, Henry Clay throws support towards John Quincy Adams. Clay then becomes Secretary of State. They refer to this as the corrupt bargain, because at that point, Secretary of State was sort of a route that a lot of people took to become president. So it was almost a foregone conclusion that if Henry Clay became Secretary of State, he eventually would become president of the United States. So a lot of Americans are angry at this corrupt bargain. We sort of have the election now focused, at least for Andrew Jackson, on fixing this wrong. So he begins his political campaigning almost immediately for 1828, based on this corrupt bargain that happened. Okay, tariff abominations. That's going to open the door for later what we've known as the nullification crisis. The tariff of abominations. Remember. Because of Henry Clay's American system, we are going to want to protect American industry. And so tariffs will be a big part. This goes way, way back. Okay. This goes way back to 1816. In 1828, the tariff was as high as 45%. And again, Southern agricultural workers and farmers rely on manufactured goods from overseas. They're spending now more money because of the tariff protecting American industry, and it's applied unfairly. It really impacts their business. So, South Carolina, the naughtiest state in American history, and its leader John C. Calhoun, he anonymously proposes the idea of nullification in what he calls the South Carolina Exposition, and he reiterates an idea that was created a long time ago. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. In their response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, they proposed the idea of nullification in the Kentucky and Virginia Resolve. So for the first time, we see that pop up again. The idea that maybe isn't such a far-fetched idea. The idea of nullification. Okay. Fast forward to the election of 1828. Remember, we talked about a lot of mudslinging, a lot of family issues that were at the heart of this court case. Jackson was a widow. A lot of other politicians were getting really personal in this election. It's John Quincy Adams for re-election versus Jackson. Jackson supported a woman who had a questionable experience. Her husband had died out in sea, and she remarried. Her name was Peggy Eaton. And because of this, and really pushing for this, was people like John C. Calhoun, the vice president. Um, Peggy Eaton is supported by Jackson. This causes a rift between Jackson and his own cabinet. His entire cabinet resigns. And remember, we talked about something called the kitchen cabinet, which is what Jackson's going to use, an unofficial cabinet. So, a very big controversy under Andrew Jackson's first term as president. Okay. Webster Hayne debate. Remember, that's a 9-day debate in which Daniel Webster goes against Robert Hayne. Daniel Webster is supporting the states, but again, he is against this idea of nullification. He says, quote, people, not the states, made the Constitution. Um, so this idea of nullification is out there. And then in 1832, we have another tariff, the tariff of 1832, that really sets off the nullification crisis. So the South had tried to get other states to join them in nullification through the South Carolina Exposition. No one did. The South is demanding a lower tariff, and so they get a slightly lower tariff in 1832, but it's not enough to really satisfy states like South Carolina. So South Carolina threatens secession, and this is really at the heart of the nullification crisis because of this tariff that's not quite as low as they want. So this is something Jackson has to deal with. Again, he supports states, but not up to the point of nullification. So this really divides him and John C. Calhoun. And eventually, Henry Clay in 1833 proposes the compromise tariff of 1833. This is going to end the crisis for now. South Carolina had gone all the way up to their state legislature in their nullification process, and they sort of dropped that after the compromise tariff of 1833, which was going to drop tariff rates 10% per year to sort of pre-tariff of 1816 levels. So it ends the crisis, but in sort of a last ditch kind of meh meh meh, chirping at each other. Two things happen. The United States passes something called the Force Bill, which the U.S. government can now use the military if necessary to collect tariffs and duties. And as sort of a last ditch, well, we still haven't lost this war. South Carolina nullifies that. So they drop the nullification of the tariff, but then they nullify the Force Bill. And this reminds us again of victories that aren't really victories, kind of like the Stamp Act was repealed and replaced with the Declaratory Act. Okay, remember Jackson's worries of the national bank. He believed that too much foreign influence was in there. He believed that it was an overreach of federal power. So again, this is him supporting the states, and they're what they call pet banks, they're state banks. But the Bank of the United States originally started with Hamilton and Washington way back in 1791. We talked about this, and I really think the best way to understand the National Bank is go back to that sheet we looked at in class from the video. Might even watch the video again. Gives you a lot of information about the purpose of the Bank of the United States. Providing deposits for the United States. Americans deposit their taxes, the tariffs, payments for new lands, lending money to businesses to help grow the American economy and grow industry, funding the military, paying off the U.S. debt. Actually, I should say prior to the War of 1812, it sort of lost its usefulness, so it wasn't renewed. But because of the War of 1812 and the debt, it was renewed. We got a couple important court cases. Remember that states had attempted to tax the Bank of the United States in McCulloch versus Maryland. The two rulings came after that saying that no, states can't tax federal entities, and the Bank of the United States is constitutional. But remember, Jackson is critical of the bank. He thinks that that the national banks are going to have a danger inherent in them, in that they're going to be very risky financial moves because of the stability of the banks, because of this constant stream of revenue. He also sees that the Bank of the United States is giving more power to the wealthy, the monopolists, speculators in land and railroads. He also is afraid of foreign investor and their influence because they're using the Bank of the United States quite a bit. And even though McCulloch versus Maryland said that the bank was constitutional, Andrew Jackson still believes that it is not. So he tells his Secretary of the Treasuries to take all the money out of the Bank of the United States, all those branches, and put them into state pet banks, private banks, to basically transfer power. And eventually, what happens? There's a guy named Roger Taney who, after a few secretaries of the Treasury refused to do that, he does it. ends up killing the bank. So the bank dies in about 1836. And unfortunately, after Jackson's tenure as president, we have this massive recession in 1837 under Martin Van Buren. So again, go back and look at that sheet when it talks about Andrew Jackson and the bank wars. So moving on, election of 1832, we've got Henry Clay versus Andrew Jackson. This is not after the National Bank. We just kind of jumped ahead there. This is what's important about this election is not really the candidates, but really, it's the first time that parties are going to nominate committees, and you have sort of a, uh, a front runner from each party. And in this particular election, two popular candidates. Andrew Jackson is very popular as a war hero for folks, the common man in the South and in the West. Henry Clay is very popular in the North with industrials. So he's got a lot of money, but Andrew Jackson has the people. And of course, as we know, Andrew Jackson wins re-election in 1832. Okay, Native Americans. Hopefully you read the sheet about Jackson and the Cherokee, which is going to lead him throughout his life to sort of have a inert hatred of Native Americans and of their presence in places like Georgia. And so throughout his career, of course, we have the Seminole Wars when he was going into Florida and mutilating and massacring Native Americans who were seen as at the time as being detrimental to white settlements there. Of course, then we have the Indian Removal Act in 1830, and Jackson spins it in a way that it looks like it's a good thing for Native Americans, essentially swapping the land that whites wanted in the East for undeveloped land in Louisiana Purchase area in places like Texas and Oklahoma and Missouri and places like that. So before he leaves office, there is a major court case, Worcester versus Georgia. The Worcester guy was defending the rights of Native Americans and their sovereignty, and ends up winning that, and it ends up giving more power to sovereign Indian nations. However, Jackson essentially ignores this court case with his Indian Removal Act and subsequent Trail of Tears in 1838 to 39 under Martin Van Buren. Okay, so understand and review that information about Jackson and the Cherokee, how they were one of the 5 civilized tribes over in the East. There were the Creeks and the Chickasaw and the Seminole and the Cherokee, and there was one more. I'm trying to remember, the Creek, I think it was. At any rate, they were just one of the many tribes that were forced to leave. Only a few of them actually received any sort of monetary compensation for leaving the home of their ancestors. But obviously, this is one of the negative aspects of Jackson and his presidency. Okay. Again, Trail of Tears, make sure you know that Jackson sort of opens the door for that, but it's really under the presidency of Martin Van Buren that happens. Okay. Other Native American issues, Black Hawk, he was an Illinois leader of a Native American tribe. They were called the Sauk tribe, not one you have to remember, but they were fighting back in the area of the now Louisiana Purchase against white encroachment. So they have some violent events between white settlers and the Native Americans. Osceola is the leader of the Seminoles down in Florida. Remember, Jackson had already dealt with the Seminoles and tried to rid Florida of the Seminoles. That's starting way back, before the War of 1812, and then Jackson goes in 1817. And in the 1830s, during his tenure as president, there's a lot of guerrilla wars trying to basically mop up all the Seminole resistance in Florida and move them westward. Okay, so by 1842, these guerrilla wars have all but wiped out any sort of Seminole presence in Florida. Okay, so moving westward still, now we get into the Texas Revolution. And remember, this begins shortly after Mexico gains independence from Spain. I believe that was 1821. And so Mexico now has this huge landmass in Texas, and Mexico needs settlement. It needs this area to be worked and settlements to be established. So it encourages American settlement, people to come in from the United States and live in Texas. And so how Mexico does this is they give out these huge land tracts. Impresarios was the term we talked about in the lecture. People like Stephen F. Austin are going to get these huge tracts of land that he is going to sort of govern and settle and cultivate. And in exchange, what the American settlers are supposed to do is abide by a series of laws, like become Mexican citizens and outlaw slavery and become Catholic, and all these different things. But essentially, what people like Stephen F. Austin do is they ignore most of those rules. So Texas sort of develops its own sort of culture, rebellious culture, and they're essentially kind of creating their own republic even prior to their actual leaving of Mexico. So Davy Crockett, James Bowie, these guys are heroes of the Texas fight for independence. Nothing really else to know about those guys. They become political leaders later. Remember that Stephen F. Austin, he goes down to Mexico to meet with Santa Anna, and this is prior to Texas declaring independence. He goes down there and he meets with Santa Anna and he tries to solve all these problems, and then Stephen F. Austin is in prison, so he goes back eventually and is released, and that's when the Texas Revolution starts. Um, and we have heroes like Sam Houston, who becomes the commander in chief and also the president of the Republic of Texas. Then we have a bunch of important battles that are losses for the Texans, but really start to move Americans into wanting to support Texas and maybe even annex Texas. So we have the Alamo in 1836, 200 Texans versus 6,000 Mexicans. The people who die there become martyrs for the Texas cause. The Goliad massacre, another massacre. There were about 400 Texans who surrender, and the Mexicans butcher them and kill them afterward anyway. So again, martyrdom is a great motivation sometimes for support, and so we get a lot of support from pro-Texas Americans. The Battle of San Jacinto is when Sam Houston uses the Mexican siesta to sort of capture Santa Anna in the middle of a nap, and he captures him, and then Santa Anna agrees to sign some treaties to make Texas independent and all these other things, but it's really a fingers crossed sort of agreement. Haha, lying. And then when they release Santa Anna, he kind of reneges on the whole deal, but essentially Texas does become a republic because of that. Okay, so that's the short version of Texas. We'll get into Texas being brought into the United States a little bit later. Okay. So 1836, the election, we've got Martin Van Buren, who is the handpicked successor of Democrat Andrew Jackson. And we have a new political party. We've got the Whigs. We've got William Henry Harrison, who we talked about before being a hero, the Battle of Tippecanoe way back in that War of 1812. Daniel Webster's a Whig. In fact, there are like 4 Whigs who run in this election in 1836. So end up splitting the vote between people who support Whigs, and Martin Van Buren wins, which is somewhat irony because the Whigs formed because of their hatred of the Democratic Party. They formed because of their hatred of Andrew Jackson. So because there were so many Whig candidates running in 1836, split the vote, and Martin Van Buren wins. Okay. Martin Van Buren, sometimes called Van Ruin because of the Panic of 1837, also because of his he had to basically fulfill the Indian Removal Act through what we call the Trail of Tears, where thousands and thousands of Native Americans died moving from the civilized areas of Georgia and the eastern United States all the way to this new unsettled territory, an uncultivated territory, and then in the Louisiana Purchase. So one of the things to understand about the Panic of 1837 is that because the Bank of the United States was now gone, there's no steady stream of income, and we have a crash. We have over speculation in railroads, over speculation in land, and because of no stable banking system, there's a lot of reasons for this, but the economy suffers a pretty big blow in 1837. Okay, and the Panic of 1837 really wasn't Martin Van Buren's fault, but it was set up through Jackson, and because of that, Panic of 1837, Martin Van Buren has no chance of winning re-election. Okay. Election of 1840, Martin Van Buren is the Democrat. I just told you he's going to lose. Okay. This time we've got William Henry Harrison as the sole Whig, and there's this idea that William Henry Harrison is just a kind of an uneducated common person, sitting on his log cabin, whittling and telling stories, and the Democrats use this to sort of characterize William Henry Harrison, but it kind of backfires, and the common man supports William Henry Harrison, the Whig. He was the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe way back in the War of 1812. His vice president, John Tyler, is going to be along with him. We have Tippecanoe and Tyler too is sort of their political motto during that election. So when William Henry Harrison wins, and within a month, William Henry Harrison is dead, and John Tyler ends up taking over. Okay. Other important things to know about this time period. This is kind of mopping up this unit, really. Frederick Jackson Turner, he has what's known as the frontier thesis. Uh, it's tied in with manifest destiny, the idea that God is sort of giving us the ability and the right to move westward and conquer. But Frederick Jackson Turner takes it up a notch a little bit. He says that democracy is tied to westward expansion. It's symbolic. Just as we are expanding, so is democracy. Democracy is ever changing, it's spreading, it's adventurous. And so, that we somehow tie this tangible thing of moving westward with the growth of our country and the growth and spreading of democracy. Another theorist at this time, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., what his main argument was that during this time of Jackson, Frederick Jackson Turner, Schlesinger, and Hofstadter, and even Alexis de Tocqueville, they all have very famous theses during this time of Jackson about what this time period was really all about, because there was so much going on. Schlesinger, he addresses the sectional conflict. Okay, he addresses the issues of slavery. He addresses the issues of imbalance politically. He addresses the issues of reform movements. He addresses issues of unfair or unbalanced infrastructure improvements. All these things when we talk about sectionalism, and he makes the argument that it's not a sectionalism between North and South, but it's all class conflict, the rich and the poor. And he makes the argument that the Jacksonian era, the 1830s, is anti-capitalist, and it's really farmers versus businessmen, and that's really the division. Okay, Richard Hofstadter, another theorist at the time, he focuses on sort of the markets and growth of industry. And he says that this is a time for entrepreneurs. This is a time that Americans are having a tough time establishing industry, and so you're going to have a lot of politicians focusing on laissez-faire policies, building up industry. William Henry Harrison, and that's going to cause a rift between the rich and the poor, because the rich become incredibly wealthy because of lack of business regulations, laissez-faire, growing American industry. Don't forget Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville. Remember, he comes over to America trying to see how it's going to look for France in the future. And some of the big things he talked about and that we talked about in class, democracy is not just a political thing. You can express yourself in a democratic way in a lot of different outlets. It's not class defined. Everyone in America, according to Tocqueville, has the equality of opportunity. You're not tied down to class. So we're going to stop there. That was our second video. We're going to do one more and talk about the reform movements and the market revolution.